Thank you. Thank you. So today, this is Joe and I am going to host this Ask Spring about China session, and I want to share a little bit how this come about. Many of you um, probably know, but maybe not everyone, that Resonance Code was published in 2019, and then at the onset of pandemic 2020. A huge energy has sucked me and my work and the Resonance Code all the way to China. And I devoted the last 3 years 100% working virtually with people all over different parts of China, and we've built a community, a network of people holding the Resonance Code as a rebirth of Taoism through the pathway of East-West integration. So the last 3 years was almost like I've never ever in my life would have thought I would live the life where I'm completely grounded in one continent, whereas my mind and heart was stretched all the way to the other side of the earth. It was a surreal life for me because I was completely unplugged from American culture, which I have invested 25 years building myself an identity in the West, and just let that fizzle away where I pour all my intention into China. And while accompanying my fellow Chinese people through this arduous journey through pandemic, lockdown, confusion, chaos, all the uncertainty that's arising, to me, there's just so much aspect of this journey. For me, it's a homecoming. In one sense, it's a homecoming. It was the first time I started to shape the work out of my integration of Eastern and Western culture in my native language. On the other hand, it's also, for me, it's almost like a reverse immigration. I experienced another wave of culture shock on my own on the land that I was born. It was just like twisting my brain in ways I just could not imagine. So just recently, in the last month, my inner guidance, my inner knowing has guided me landing myself back into the Western world. So I'm now straddling. So I'm now start to rebuild myself with Joe in the English speaking side. And I feel that the Resonance Code is like a giant with one foot in China and another foot in Pacific Northwest now. It's still wobbling, but that's at least that's what's taking shape. So I thought I want to gather my friends, my colleagues, and people who are supporting our work, our institute's work, and we share this. We have a sense making together. I know a lot of people are interested, curious, wondering about what's happening in China, how to make sense of that. So I want to just share my personal journey with you as one thread of reference point. And before we start, I want to presence one source of inspiration, or almost for me, it's the source from which I access the spirit of China that I held in my heart. So I feel the China that lives in my heart is thousands of years old. The Chinese culture that lives in my heart is thousands of years old, and it has its use. It's a vital, vibrant, useful time, like in the Tang Dynasty. And I very much experience right now the way that things are. There's a lot of grief, pain, burden from the past that's are being transmuted. But very much in my heart, I feel like I kept a thread of energetic thread with that, the vibrancy of the spirit that has lived on this land. And one way I access it is through poetry and music. So I want to share first a song that I wrote, I put the music on a Tang Dynasty poem written by Li Bai, the most well-known poet, the most prolific, very prolific and extremely romantic, wild, imaginative poet. And this poem is about the Yangtze River. He is one day sailing down, Yangtze River is the mother river that gave birth to Chinese culture. And he was just sailing down the river and feeling the spirit of the river and calling out with the monkeys in the forest, lining up the river bank, and just have a wild time. So this is a poem that was very dear to my heart. My dad read it to me when I was young. And a decade ago, many years ago, when I first started learning music, it was one of the first songs that came to me. So I would like to share that with you. So when I sing, I'm going to turn on a Zoom setting, which will require you all mute yourself, otherwise there will be echoing. So make sure you mute yourself. So is the sound going well? Okay. 朝辞白帝彩云间，千里江陵，一日还两岸，远声啼不住，轻舟已过万重山。朝辞白帝彩云间，千里江陵，一日还两岸，远声啼不住，轻舟已过万重山。呼嘿哈，呼嘿哈，呼嘿哈啦咿嘿，嗨呀啦来，呼嘿哈咿嘿。 Thank you for sharing that with me. So now I shared why I host this session, and I would like to invite some check-ins from people here. And we have 26 some people, so we're not gonna invite everyone to speak because that will burn our time. So I would like to ask people to reflect on what have brought you here. Well, why are you interested in Ask Spring something about China? And I'm gonna invite 3 to 5 people to speak in the group. And for other people, I would like to invite you to put your reflection of that question into the chat box. And we'll just read the written response and invite 3 to 5 people to speak. So let's have like a minute of silence, and then I'll ring a bell, and then I'll invite people to speak. Oh. So now the space is open. Any of you feel moved, please open your mic and speak.
Yeah.
I heard someone speaking.
I can speak.
Hello, Alan.
It's really, I'm getting a echo.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, it's yeah, and I think it's gone now. So because you and I know each other well, and I've watched this whole process, Spring, what brought me today really, aside from the fact that, I have an enormous amount of respect for what it is you're doing and the work, is that I've been able to interact with some of the people in China and did a donkey ride with them. And one of the things that is in my heart is how they're navigating the very oppressive kind of policies that we understand from the Western world are worse than ours. I'm not so sure they are. How they're navigating that and finding ways of embracing new ways of thinking around governance. Or are they thinking of new ways around government? I'm just curious. Mine is a huge curiosity about what's actually happening.
Great. Thank you. So I think for the sake of me gathering information in the space, I'm gonna just read out the things in the chat room so we can all get a feel of what are the questions and the curiosities. Lin wrote many misconceptions about China and the Chinese people in my culture. Lisa wrote, I'm interested to know what's happening in China for Spring's sake with respect to the work, and also because so many Earth people are there. Also in her own work, she has friends in China and wonder how it's for them, whether their relationship with Enlivening Edge, which is which is an online platform that's interested in the new way of governance and organizational principle that's in Leveling Edge, whether that is endangering them and what courage they need. And Alan wrote, I feel that being a practitioner of Taoism in China in a previous life, and I'm curious about the way Taoism can be revived in today's China. Aliyah, same as Alan, the social credits of human rights. Wendy says, a synchronicity brought me here. Someone who read my blog post yesterday sent this webinar, because the themes seem to align. Wow, I have to read your blog post, Wendy. Charlie says, like the river, China herself is a mother to the world in many ways. For me, as was having studied and experienced some of her cultural, spiritual, technological children, there are so many ways this conversation and work is vitally important and timely. There was a fascinating week or so last year when droves of mainland Chinese made their way to the Clubhouse app before being blocked. So I was around for some of the incredible conversations, indescribable. What I know, Firelight wrote to me directly. I don't know if you want to share that to everyone or.
On accident, actually. Everything I know about China has been shaped by the Western media, so I'm just here to learn.
Yeah, right. David says, are people in China expressing concerns about potentially going to war with Western country? Daniel says, I first learned of you when I heard of a talk by Fion Wright, and I'm particularly intrigued with the integration between Taoism and the Resonance Path Institute. Awesome. Yeah, all of you brought exactly the questions, the questions I pondered in my mind when I came to do this. And I saw Lynn raising hands. Lynn, would you like to say something?
Yes. Yes, Spring. I experienced something at Thanksgiving here in the States this Thanksgiving, in which I had this overwhelming understanding. We owe so much gratitude for the comforts that we have in our world available to us due to the people of China. I mean, the idea that people discount when something, you turn it up and the bottom says made in China. But the reality is that we owe a lot of gratitude to the Chinese people for much of what we find and use for comfort, gifts, and so on.
Yeah, appreciate. I honor your saying that. Thank you. I saw Lisa wrote, I have read a great deal about the Chinese history, especially when I was in college. I find it hard to reconcile the China I learned about then and the China I read about now. I know there are deep themes running through, but can't see them clearly. Ditto. I have a hard time reconcile the China I know in my heart and the China that's revealing herself now. Okay. So wait another half minute, and if no one else comes through, then I can start talk.
There was, Charles here, just a quick comment. Something I overheard recently, and maybe it's a kind of well-known saying, like to pick your enemies carefully. And it was a comment about the US because you become like them. So just wanted to offer that. Thanks.
Yeah. Joseph.
Yes, on a rather personal note, Spring, I'm wondering what it's like for you. Were talking at the beginning about being in two worlds and having your mind and heart spread across the ocean, particularly the last 3 years. And I'm just wondering at least the aspects that I've understand in my tiny limited knowledge about the use of technology to control the censoring of the internet and all the things that at least that I'm aware of, and which is a minuscule amount of the truth. But I'm wondering how you yourself hold the tension with what's in your heart and what you know, and some of these other aspects of the culture and politics of the people that you're close with in China. How you're handling that yourself, how you square that circle.
Yeah. Thank you, Joseph.
Spring, this is Kabir.
Yeah, hi, Kabir.
Yeah, I think my question about has to do with about the lens. I'm, almost entirely an English speaker, raised in America, traveled some, but not deeply immersed in other cultures. And I know that I just have an implicit clarity around the value of freedom and individualism and the kinds of social structures and governance structures that are prioritized to serve that. And so I know that it's very easy to step into a lens of, well, China is an example of an authoritarian regime, a very sophisticated one that, to Joseph's comment, uses technology to really narrow and steer the population. At the same time, they use TikTok to encourage their youth to have aspirations to be scientists and inquisitors, and so I've got a lot of curiosity just around how else can that massive force that is China be conceived that's well outside the pathways of construct that my mind is super familiar with and
Yeah,
doesn't necessarily see outside of.
yeah. Yeah, thank you. Those are all great questions. I'm gonna read two more that come to the chat room. Victoria says, wondering about impact of pandemic in China and how resonance code is influencing, shaping the experience for those involved in our work. Wendy asks, is the form of Taoism that the Chinese government is reviving authentic to the centuries-old Taoism? For example, certain magical practices are still suppressed and not allowed. Wonder what that grassroots practice are like. Oh, there's also Sarah's. I missed. I've traveled twice to China and see the beauty, appreciate the long history and the culture. I was witness to a grandmother protest while there. I was moved that elders were so grounded and brave. I want to know more and understand more. I feel kind of kinship through friends. Firelight says, what was it like to be looking back at the West through your Chinese conscious attuned eyes? Okay. I think I'm gonna start to pick it up from here. And before I start, I want to just invite my partner Joe to stand by my side, because many of the sense making and the thought shaping formation happening in our day-to-day conversation, these are all the things we talk on our dinner table while cooking, walking the dogs. So a lot of the ideas in my heart, I had intuitive knowing growing up, but it was very much through talking with Joe, people like Joe, but it's particularly Joe because he's with me all the time, that these ideas come from my embodied sense, knowing, intuition into words. And but sometimes I still struggle with how to put it into English that makes sense. So I invited Joe to be my kind of translator if he sees that there's a break. Joe, do you want to say anything before I start?
Oh, just that I'm pretty excited about who's here and the questions that y'all have and what the kind of conversation that we're likely to have. And so, yeah, my role would be just kind of to soften the interface between your world and our Western world.
Mm-hmm.
Possible, yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm thinking, I'm just taking all these questions in, and I think it may be helpful for me to tell a little bit of my journey, so that will give you a sense of my particular lens. Like I said in the intro, this is not about news. This is not a like objective, neutral news broadcast. This is really Spring's lens and the Resonance Path Institute's perspective. So I think it was Kabir. You raised a very important point that a very fundamental value in the West is freedom and individualism. But the Chinese culture is really hinged on a different set of fundamental value, which is harmony and the relationship and the integrity of we. All right. So and individualism and freedom is quite far down the chain of what's important. And that's, however, having said that, it doesn't mean that there people also value freedom and individualism, but in reverence or giving priority to the other side of value. So one thing I want to share first is that the microcultural milieu that I was brought up in, my parents were intellectuals in the 70s. That's when at a time when few people in China has access to information coming from outside, from the West, but they do. They and their peers who are scientists, because they could read English, they have access, they work with Western people. So they immediately, from the very beginning, they taught me not to trust what the government says, because they can compare what the textbook says. I actually honestly read the textbook growing up. Western people are suffering under capitalism, and their workers, there's picture in my mind where the factory owner were dumping milks into the river, where people in the street starving. Poor people can. So every culture has their propaganda. You guys have your version of propaganda for the China is, and but my parents were. So what I want to say is that the cultural milieu I was brought up in is already pro-West. Is very much closer to the West in the context of the Chinese culture. So we were my parents and the people like my parents and were very curious about individualism, freedom of speech, all these things. That's why I was, they encouraged me to learn English well and come to United States to build my life from very early on. So, so as a result, I actually grew up with this strong tension with the Chinese culture that at that time, where there's this huge suppress of freedom of speech, particularly. I was very much, I have a intense emotional feeling about it. So that was kind of my background. At the same time, so after I came to the United States, many stories, many twists and turns. I got to embrace the ancient Taoism, the ancient Taoism, and I realized what I experienced as China today. It's really, if you think about, like I said at the beginning, if a person is several thousand years old, right, and its use is about 1,000, 2,000 years ago, and now it's at like this end term. So I really was born into a culture where it's very old and frail, but that doesn't represent its whole entire life force. So I so the last 10 years I was devoting myself to access this ancient Taoism through my embodied intuition way of knowing, and understand how to articulate it, and collaborated with Joe and many of you, like Joseph and Ellen and Victoria, Firelight. All these people helped me to articulate the resonance code, which is really how I can articulate through my life experience of my understanding of ancient Taoism is. So at the big onset of pandemic, I was invited back to China. So I had this romantic vision that I'm gonna return, this ancient Taoism is gonna return to China and gonna be embraced by my Chinese people, which is actually partly true. But I also learned a lot of things I didn't anticipate to learn. And that's gonna address some of the questions coming up from the audience. So first of all, let's see. Let's take Ellen's question. Ellen asked from the very beginning how the Chinese people navigate the very oppressive policy, more oppressive than the West, right? So let me take it back before I tell you my experience of that. First of all, my engagement of Chinese population is, of course, a very narrow sliver. There's no way that's representative. However, it is what resonance code has called for, right? So these people, what are these people? They tend to be they are like the first wave of people who waken up to kind of the spiritual dimension of life. So in the last 30, 40 years, China has been like growing full speed into the economic development, trying to catch up with the West, and really going to the material aspect of worldview. Even like more Western, it's almost like they want to outdo the West. You brought material material worldview to us. I'm gonna be even more material than you are. So, but the people I work with are among the first who have decoupled themselves from that worldview and start to re-examine life through the dimension of spirit, heart, soul awakening. This kind of let's see. And another characteristic of this population that I interface is they are 90% women. They're 90% women. Let's see what other. So their profession ranges from there's quite a bit of actually stay-home mom and teacher, a lot of teacher, educator, people who are interested in organizational development, governance, how to build a new way of organizing communities, collectives, groups. What's the new way of governance? And a fair amount of people who would call them spiritual seekers, who are going back to Taoism, Buddhism, this kind of practice, and a fair amount of people who are interested in embodied practice. Okay, so this is the particular group that I'm working with. So I'm just gonna answer Ellen's question, and I'll take a pause. So the thing that the first thing that's very shocking to me when I started to get to know these people and start to build the trust with them, I realized most of people do not experience their government as oppressive. Or, I don't know if they don't acknowledge it or there's a I cannot say whether it's they experienced it but do not acknowledge it or do not experience it. However, they do tell me a lot of the aspect they feel grateful of their government. There are many things. The thing is, in the last 3 decades, China has lifted itself from such, what we call in the West as poverty. People have gained so much wealth, not just wealth, but the freedom of travel, freedom of do things that they could never imagine before. And they've built confidence, they've built assets, they've built, a lot of things has grown in the last 3 decades. They actually feel quite put off when the Western keep telling them they live with an oppressive government. Right. And also taken in that at the beginning I said their value is not fundamentally based on freedom and individuality. It's fundamentally based on harmony and integrity of a collective. So so there's a very strong sense that we are a we, and it's not like many of these people do have a lot of criticism of the government, but the government is also part of the we. It's almost like, if you're in a big family, there is a grumpy old, so it's almost like the metaphor is the government is almost like the most grumpy old grandfather in the family that pissed off everyone, but he's still part of the family, and they feel still protective if other people lash out on him. Yeah. So this is another thing I want to say about the Chinese culture that's different than the Western culture, is that in the, especially in America, people coming from different cultural background come here to cohered as a country based on a set of principles, belief, worldviews. But in China, the collective is cohered much more like a family, like a big family. The shared history, shared cultural heritage is like at the core, and there's much more felt sense of bonding with each other. So I know this might sound shocking to you. It's shocking to me too. It's very difficult for me to find it wasn't until 2 years since after I worked with people, we started to talk about politics, and I had a huge struggle. How do I stay true with how I feel and also stay connected with their worldview, and respect what they feel and how they make sense of things. Yeah. So I'm going to just pause for a moment and maybe Joe can tell me if there's any parts that needs clarification or enrichment, and maybe there's more questions coming from here.
You're doing great. I would invite people to imagine what it's like to live in a place where the people around you all look like you, speak the same language as you, and that they have been that way in that place for thousands of years. None of us in the rest of the world, except for maybe Africa, have that. And China's, the artifacts of the civilization create this tangible connection to that history in a way that may not be as true in Africa. But to have that as a core of your identity is a really, really different experience than any of us have. Place is so important when you have the capacity to really connect deeply to it. Yeah. And that's actually one of the things that is creating the changes in China. Is it used to be that your family was embedded in a specific province, in a specific place in China for all of history, pretty much. And in the last 30 years, everybody's jumping from here to there to go to get work in the cities, and families are separated, and there's a lot of disruption, a lot like happened in the United States with the Industrial Revolution and everything after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, should I continue? I want to, finish the last half of it. So, so what I learned, when I realized when I encounter my fellow Chinese students, coworker, colleagues, what I learned is that I actually did embody this West. I lived in the West for 20 some years. I grew up in a family culture where that was encouraged and valued. So when I returned to China, I realized I carry this unconscious criticism. Like there's part of me is pointing to them, that you should speak up, you should embrace freedom of speech, but that should actually come from a place that doesn't respect their own sovereignty and agency. So it took me a lot to work through what is it in me that demands them to do that. And I mean, it's a hell of a journey for me to get to the bottom of it. But what I just want to say is that, in Ellen's question, she also asked, do people embrace new way of governance? Absolutely. The fact that they put up this old grumpy grandfather doesn't mean they don't want to change either. It's just that I learned that they are asking for a different way of change. Not change by, shouting or protesting and criticizing, but there's something else going on. Like people are so devoted to understand how, the people I work with are constantly testing out, experimenting with new ways of forming relationship, forming communities. They are extremely devoted to putting themselves, their own life energy. Like my 3 years work is completely based on volunteer. Without their volunteer support, there's no way that I could plan myself. So for so long, halfway across Pacific Ocean, all entirely through internet. They are very dedicated, but the thing is that it's almost like there's a very steady ground up. They're not going to change the government right yet, but there's all these small scale experiment that's happening in micro doses. And I learned how to trust that, and trust that love and allowing and embracing is probably more of a changing force than demanding someone else or some other things to change. Yeah. So for me, it's a huge journey to learn where I have to look deeply into myself, like where does that criticism come from? Why do I demand them to change? And how do I shift myself to let go of that? And miraculously, when I let go of that, I actually there's a lot of like energy rising up. I actually did go into some kind of conflict with people I worked with very intimately in 2.5 years, and we arrived at a place and saw there we have such gigantic like political view gap between us that's going to threaten to pull the relationship apart. But when I learned to soften that and holding who they are, where they are, as what they are, without asking and demanding them, guess what? A week later, the lockdown policy has eased up, and people in China started like actually protest. I was just like, oh my God. Finally, I don't need I don't require that to happen, and now it happens. But you know, this is after like half year. There's so much turmoil inside of me. It's like, ow, how could you put up with that? How could you put up a dictator? How can you like you know, so self annihilation and put up with authoritarian, all these barrage of criticism in me. When I finally let go, that's when when I actually see a rising of a different kind of consciousness. So yeah. So I'm gonna pause for a moment to just let people let me take in how people respond from the chat.
I have a quick question, and I'm sorry if you said it and I didn't catch it, but what was the context or the framing of your getting together with these people, mostly women? I didn't catch that. What was the sort of...
It's mostly teaching resonance code.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So I want to say something about the teaching resonance, my experience of teaching resonance code there. Because I want to, next I want to address about Taoism. So I was such an oddity, like a novelty to many people there, because for one, a lot of spiritual teachers are men. A majority of them are men. So you got all these groups where there's one male teacher and 90% of female students, right? And even when there is a women teacher, she is still mostly carrying kind of the teaching coming from a male patriarch tradition, whereas I come in with a so one thing that I think resonance code is bringing to or giving people permission is really to be themselves, to be their authentic self. So I'm not trying to be I encourage people to speak from their vulnerability and to talk about their feelings and to celebrate whatever that imperfection is, because you know, under the thousands years of tradition, here's one thing that's really hard very, very hard for me to experience, because China has like thousands of years of spiritual tradition. Everyone knows what should look like with a spiritually attuned, enlightened way of being, but that kills authenticity, that kills spontaneity, and it's not. People are not. You can't live from a place of beingness to everyone trying to like live according to the code, the rule, like passed down by the ancestors, and that just. So I was there openly working against that currents, and so the people that drawn to me are people who are in support of that. Yeah. So
or who have a self-chosen role to challenge what you're bringing. There's one or two of those too.
Oh yeah, right. So I see, just now I saw a raising hand, but I don't see it anymore.
That was Kabir.
Kabir, are you still there?
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to just reflect on what I heard you say and see if I'm clearly understanding. I think one of the things that you said early was the objections you heard to being criticized for having an oppressive government. And governance processes inherently oppress something. And so I wondered, is it, and I think what I heard you saying, I'm just putting this in different words to see if I've got it, is that while the government may be oppressing certain things, it's doing so in favor of promoting other things, and that those things that are being oppressed are far enough down the value stack, much like, say, the environment here in the United States, far enough down the value stack that oppression of that is not seen as a burdensome cost.
Mm-hmm.
It's the price of business when you're actually building harmony and collective continuity. And then I guess that just led me to one other question. I'll just squeeze it in here. Is that one of the challenges I've always had with authoritarian type structures is that the creative mind that is dictating the larger energy movements is narrowed. It's just one person or 100 people instead of 1 million people or 100 million people. And so that's a much more refined state. And I wondered, is that any different than the cultural dictates of China over the last 10,000 years? Has it always been kind of the mind of the emperor or the mind of a ruling class that has dictated the broader cultural process of the nation? And so in that sense, is this any different if it's Xi Jinping and the CCP? So,
Mm-hmm. So there are two layers of my answer to your comments. One is that many people, my parents, and including those people I work with, who tell me that they don't feel oppressive, or it's not like they don't feel oppressive. It's just they're pushing back this pressure from outside, from West mainly, to press them to change in ways that's not consistent in themselves, including those people. That we all say that, Xi Jinping just have a different. Basically, there's an acknowledgement. There's something remained the same. Something. Even though the current regime call themselves communism, socialism, whatever, but it's actually the look and the feel of it is not that different than the emperor and that kind of social structure. So that's one layer. And second layer is that for me, and now I've got this, I feel. It's interesting that how we narrate the history. We, I think in our modern mind, trying to contribute a cause and effect, and we say, okay, those ruling class, those few individuals, they have this such a power, and they are like the reason for this oppressive structure. But is that true, or is that the only way to see it? For me, actually, I'm actively experimenting on different way of seeing it, is that actually these few individuals of ruling class, be it emperor in the ancient China, or today's, the billionaire, the oligarchy of the West, they are actually an expression of collective consciousness. They don't have, for me, actually, I don't no longer see them have power anymore. They are so much determined by the gigantic force rising in the mass that concentrated on this spot that they inhabit. They actually don't have much freedom to be anything else, but to show in a grotesque way what's inside of each one of us. So,
brilliant. Thank you.
And I'm not sure I will go into that story here, but when I take on that view, I was actually asking myself, can I find the Xi Jinping in me? And I tell you at the beginning, I have this visceral, like, I know, like he is the least person I want to be like, right? Like I can feel that down my spine, there's this like convulsion of, but I don't think I have time to, this might be a story of another time, but I did find him in me. And it was, I mean, Joe witnessed, it was, very terrifying and a lot of turmoil. But I think but I'm very grateful that all I've gone through and many people around me helped me to find that spring version of Xi Jinping in me. It's so liberating when I can feel him in me, that I no longer feel I'm subjected to his tyranny and his whimsical whatever. Before that, and I was crying so many times, like how can he turn the country, beloved country, the land that I so much love, into such a grotesque, like lockdown, people just it was just like horrible. But when I can find that in me, that liberation is just just unprecedented. So yeah, so I'm really loosened up that sense that, oh, it's all about these few dictators. It's really about all of us. Yeah, so so someone raised a hand. Let's see. John. Oh, John. Hi. I didn't realize
Hi,
you. Oh, hello.
so good to see you.
Yeah.
So my question, I just came back from Sri Lanka, 2 months in the monastery there. They are having a climate catastrophe. People are starving. There is no fuel. However, the collective society is treating each other very kindly in a way that we don't in our culture, right? And they have a Buddhist background or Hindu, but they have a collective sense of themselves and a collective sense of getting through suffering. Yeah. So my question about China, last time I was in China, I was so impressed with the basic communal spirit. People really pulled together and they didn't argue the higher politics too much.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the real question as vis-a-vis our society. Societies that have a more collective consciousness, there is less ego, there is less I am not so important. We are more important. And so my energy goes to the we, as you've been speaking about, which is a very positive force, right? Now, in awakening work, the less ego you are brought up with, the more we, the easier to take on that inner journey. The inner journey is absolutely individual and private. It is not the we.
Right, right.
But if you come from the we, you have a great advantage. It's easier to. Right. So we are in a very competitive culture. Coming back to North America, this last 2 weeks has been a huge shock, And so my question is, what of the goodness of the collective in China, which is a power? So as the world is falling apart, and it is, everywhere I go, the climate is really bad. As we face that, what can be transposed from the collective consciousness of China that is positive into our Western Occidental culture where we are all so individual? But, people in Sri Lanka who used to have 3 meals, now they have 2. Those who had 2 meals have 1. Wow. But they are treating each other very kindly. We don't do that here. If we have to line up for everything, we become quite combative. We suffer from hyper individuality, which means hyper isolation. So what did you experience in China? Not the authoritarian part, but the Confucian and the we-based consciousness that is positive and wholesome. How do we get more of that here? How do you see that happening?
Yeah. Thank you, John. It's interesting, John, things are, what you said is certainly true. And I also experienced the reverse can be true too. Oops, there's a echo. So I want to also, I really think China is teaching me about the complexity. There's no single, for every positive side, there's a negative side. And for every negative side, there's a positive side. First of all, I really echo with what you said. The we is not an annihilation of I, but we actually set up a condition for a different I to emerge. Like you really have to have a very spacious inner capacity to inhabit the we. And I think that I-we configuration is what China is teaching. And I think there's a lot the West can teach from the Western exploration of humanity too. But I want to say is that because the China in the last 30, 40 years, there's such a explosive rate of growth of individualism. And, the China today is not a purely collective culture. It's a mixture of Westernization, very people who are trying to go back to the old tradition, people who try to make something out of it. It's a something that we cannot we cannot grab with our control with our mental intellectualization. I think I just want to share with me, I think China embodies uncertainty, embodies chaos. And when I say chaos, I don't mean a negative way, but a pregnant chaos. It will show you, at least my journey is, it's like a mirror. It magnifies the best part of you and the worst part of you. And it's up to you how you shape and change your relationship with it. And I think that's the journey I want to, my coming back to the West is I want to stand along with my Western allies and friends to embark on that journey. And how, because I part of my life, I live in North America. This land has fed and nourished me. I am here. So I want to be on this journey with China, with you all. And let's see what else I want to say around that. Another thing, maybe just to share a little bit. For example, a few days ago, I hosted a session with my Chinese friends and invite them to share their experience of the pandemic. And of course, a lot of people shared the pain and the grief and all the challenge that they face. But half of the people, especially these women, they are less evolved. A lot of women who are more leading an inward life, they celebrate the pandemic because it gave them the first time they feel like they have an advantage. They loved the inwardness, the slowdown of the society. All that is humming and hassling outside. That has to fall away. And these people who really lead inward life, actually, they are encouraged more to come out in this pandemic forced what we call lockdown. It actually gave space to a different kind of life, different kind of force to coming through. Yeah. So I'm just I'm also responding in a chaotic way. Whatever come to my mind, not necessarily logical. Let's see, Alan, you raised your hand. Would you like to?
Yes, thank you, Spring. You describe China, at least before the last 30 years, as an indigenous culture, attachment to land, stability, etc. And how much, and as Europe, pre-modern culture was an indigenous culture, and it got disrupted by 5 centuries of modernity, of forcing. How much of what was there is actually being disrupted for the worse? I mean, there's of course good things that makes it more difficult to reclaim what provides the sense of the we, as people start moving around and live in different places and are uprooted from their family, etc. Can you touch on that? And that is linked for me to the practice of Tao.
Yeah, totally.
in one's life.
Yeah. So it's interesting that for Chinese people, this sense of disruption, chaos, and rebuild happens over and over and over and over again in our history. So this is not the first time we go through this. So yeah, so there are a lot to be disrupted, a lot. I mean, that's the last so that's why I stopped going back to China, because every time, in the last 2 decades when I was in the United States, every time I went back, I wept. I wept. I cried. It's so painful to watch. At the same time, there are two other currents. One is that I kept surprised, like how much is there actually. I didn't like there from time to time. A village that hidden in the remote part of the China that I never knew before came to my awareness. I was like, wow, I never knew that exists. So we don't know how much there is actually. And the second is that now the tide is actually also coming back. So, in the industrialization period, people left their village and all go to the big cities and become like slaves to capitalism. But then there are another end, there are young people who graduated from college or young professionals. They're going back to live in the empty village and rebuild them, and bringing back the modern culture and yeah. So there's this returning tide too. And regarding Taoism, I also have complex feeling about it. So there's one movement of people who they really divorce themselves from the modernized mind and stick with they went back to the tradition and want to reproduce the traditional way of custom and way of living and all that. I have mixed feeling about it. On one hand, it nourishes and heals a part of me that's wounding. On the other hand, I also question if it's not a living culture and a living wisdom. How is that? I know certainly it's not for me. I cannot so there's the original wholeness, before the industrialization, the wholeness of human and nature in one, in harmony. And then there's the disruption. And then there's this returned wholeness, the wholeness we return to. And that is an inclusion, an integration of the disruption that has happened. Not we cannot just don't jump back to, at least I can no longer practice and reproduce the cultural tradition that accompanying this original wholeness anymore. So about Taoism, I want to say one more thing. There's Wendy, I don't know if she's still here. She's still here. She asked this question about the Taoism, the Chinese government advocate is that authentic to the original Taoism and the magical, all these magical and shamanic forms that obviously has been invalidated by the mainstream media or mainstream mindset paradigm. So here's interesting thing is, of course, for myself, there's like a top-down enforced kind of a dogma-based so-called Taoism. For me, it's not a living wisdom. It's not a living culture. However, this is something that comes to me as a huge surprise and served as actually a great catalyst for my own transformation. So one co-worker that I had in China, she told me about months ago, maybe 2 months ago, she met a Taoist master who was a descendant of I Ching, the divinatory. He's a lineage. He has a family lineage who is a lineage carrier of this divinatory practice, I Ching. He recently was hired by the government, the Bureau of Security. The Bureau of Security, Central Bureau of Security, is the government agency who have all these like mass control system, right? So this is actually not completely new to me, because even in Mao's time, Mao is an avid believer of divination and the feng shui and all these things. So Mao has this two sides. One side, he supported this propaganda that is erected this material scientific worldview that totally suppressed our ancient history and practice and they call it superstitious. On the other hand, he himself adopted and totally like he's an avid believer of that. He seeks out the most adept shamans in the country to serve him. And this tradition, it's just, I realized, carried out to modern world too. It really confirms with my sense, it's not about modernity, shamanism, indigenous, all of this can be corrupted, or all of this can take on a form that I'm no longer, it's not authentic, it's not consistent with me anymore. So it's really come back to how we are in relationship with whatever that is. When I heard that news, it was the most devastating news for me. Because as you all know, that resonance code is my kind of my own interpretation of what I Ching is, and the last thing I want to be associated with is a tradition that's being used to control the mass. And here I am, that try to reconcile with that.
I wanted to come in if I might. Thank you, Spring. This is amazing. Just thank you. So something you said much earlier about maybe passing comment about catching up with the West in terms of maybe technology, and so I wanted to bring in this idea of innovation and progress, and in the spectrum between that and oppression, right? And how that sort of spirals back, and in terms of like where you just were with the security and the surveillance and all, and then this thing that's sort of coming up into the hands of a lot of people right now with the chat GPT, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and I don't know if you had some sort of comments, insights about kind of this drive to spend on technology and innovation, and then how that's actually being used, and how that also relates, of course, to the West at this point. So, thanks.
Yeah, For that, I can only comment preferal. How do you say that, Joe? As a peripheral observer, because peripheral observer, because my nature is I try to use as minimal technology as possible, but just a very general superficial comment. I think the technology, again, it's technology, it's the double-edged sword. I see definitely, how do I say it? I'm very amazed by the amount of technological innovation that's happening in China. I think in many ways, technologically, it is more advanced in the West. The China is more advanced in the West than the West already, and it can be the double-edged sword. It can be used for double down the control and the exploitation and corruption, or it can be used for more freedom and integration and wholeness. It's really up to individual, the micro environment, how you use that. Yeah. Let's see. Is there anything in the chat that I should pay attention to? David Catter wondering what extent you're familiar with integral theory and developmental psychology. Either of these lens help you understand the influence or perspective of what's happening and what wants to happen. Right? Thank you, David. I'm quite familiar with integral theory and developmental psychology, and in fact, that's greatly influenced the development of my work resonance code. So that's a short answer to this question. So let's see what else.
There's a dimension to all of this that I think I would like to introduce too that I haven't heard quite yet, which is and it was particularly relevant too when we passed through talking about the we culture versus the I, the hyper individualism. There's another layer to that I think is important, which is that in order to inhabit a we culture, you must be aware of and able to respond to subtle cues that you get from the people around you. In order to inhabit the hyper-individualism, or the way that we inhabit it, is by, in large part, by attaching ourselves to linguistically constructed meaning-making systems and having a clear sense of the definition of value. How do I go up the value scale or avoid coming down the value scale relative to other people? Because it's not just about being a unique individual, it's about being a high value unique individual. The consequence of that is that in the West, people are it's about patterns of attention. Where is your attention? Where does it live? Day to day, hour by hour, minute by minute. And in the West, our attention tends to be focused on thought. And in the East, in places like China and in more indigenous places that are more connected to their indigenous roots, I am guessing like Sri Lanka, I'm sure of that, there is much more attention that lives in the feeling realm. The feeling realm has a certain complexity and deep wisdom to it that in the West we lose access to. This gets demonstrated really easily when, like, Spring was able to bring feeling work back to China, to Chinese people, and have it easily accepted and used, because the Chinese, at least the female Chinese way of inhabiting feeling, gave them easy access to that world, and feeling work gave them the tools to do it, you know, to add something to their experience. Whereas it's a lot harder to get people in the West to actually feel something.
Mm.
So yeah, so maybe.
Yeah, so I just want to catch the heel of what Joe said, and also with this developmental psychology thing that David put in there. You know, what does that mean by a cultural that hinged on feeling? Is that it's inconceivable for me. My mind is still very much like, my relationship with language is still very much based on feeling. It's inconceivable for me to imagine there is a universal theory about human consciousness and development. And that's something that I actually have a huge issue with the Western theory. Is it try to come up with a universal way of explaining. That's just that doesn't exist in my Chinese consciousness. Like my students, a lot of my students, they learn a lot of different constructs, conceptual framework. It's not like they try to see this conceptual framework through. It's not like they try to see the world through this conceptual framework. They're feeling into, like, how do I feel like inhabiting this conceptual framework? Is it congruent with my body, my heart, and my sensibility, or do I take on a different conceptual framework? They're so flexible in, like, moving from one conceptual framework to another. In this one, the yin and the yang is defined that way. Another one, yin and the yang defined a different way. It's not about, like, trying to define the world through language, but it's really, language is help us to inhabit a feeling bandwidth. It's more like the things we say is more like music, songs, right? You turn on Spotify, you try to find a channel that makes you feel groovy, and that's how we relate with the language, the words, and that's actually part of, like, the Chinese don't feel oppressed as much as Western people do in the lack of freedom of speech, because they can find other ways to express themselves. Like, I do that with my peer all the time. The things that, they censorship, they would block out certain words you cannot say on WeChat. Well, we just come up with other ways to say it. That's actually kind of turned into a game. It's kind of like fun that you build this code, like, on the fly with your friends to talk about the things you want to say. Yeah, it's a very different way to inhabit our linguistic mind. So yeah, like Alan said, I believe that can happen in English too. I see Lisa raised a hand. Are you still?
Yeah,
Lisa?
I'm still here.
Yeah.
I have my video off because I'm walking my dog and listening intently. But so my question, it kind of goes back to just that conversation between you and Joe was fascinating right then, and I kind of want to go there. But I have a question that's about this sort of we-I integration, because I've been doing. I spent all my career in and out of government. I studied it, and then I worked for elected officials, and then I worked for public agencies, and it's like in my blood. And so I'm really intrigued with the conversation of where governance goes next here. And I recently did a kind of my own reading, and one of the I Ching, the hexagram that came up about what I'm learning is actually a hexagram, I think it's 37, which relates to family, which relates to we. And I think that I have been steeped in a culture of I, working within a government framework that's dominated by I. And I can see that the healing that's needed within our government systems in America have to do with how we do an embodied we, how we integrate with the embodied we that isn't a kind of a hyper woke, unfortunately not very we. it can be quite exclusive in the way it's applied right now. It'll make people who are not identified with any you know an outsider, they'll start to, it will just reverse the power dynamic, which is starting to happen. And so I'm really interested in how America and China represent these, you know, how China brings in the philosophy of the I into the government, new government structures, and then how we do the reverse.
Right.
Right. And what does that begin?
Right.
And what can we learn about China for ourselves and doing that well, and vice versa, but in a healthy way as opposed to a competitive way. I mean, wow, there's something so amazing to imagine that as a possibility, as opposed to sort of seeing ourselves as enemies and warring and blah, 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 you know? Wow. So that's my, that was my kind of comment question.
Lisa, I'm totally with you. I mean, the thing is, in both China and the US, there's something shared common, is that in China, the we sees I as a threat to the we. And in the West, in the US particularly, the I is done at the expense, the cost of hurting the we. But what would be like actually we can have the I and the we being in a mutually nourishing, empowering relationship. And that's something, I think that's the edge of evolution. That's what we're here to learn. And both people on this side of Pacific and that side of Pacific, there are plenty of people who are interested in this. Certainly, probably not the Xi Jinping's crew, but why do we care so much about this?
Wow, that's really, that really gives me something to chew on in this next year as I think about going back into government, which I was hesitant to do. So it's just been, this is a huge awakening for me, Spring. Thank you so much.
And I just, from the limited, the small experiment that Joe and I have done, that's exactly what you described is exactly what Joe and I have experimented in our relationship with each other and our relationship, with our work, is exactly that. We don't believe I and we has to be at odds. In fact, all an instance of wholeness. They're all in the, there's a wholeness in the I and there's a wholeness in the we. So, and you are very right. I think without the respecting the individuality, the we that China is becomes a very hardened we. It becomes very rigid, and can be aggressive and can be harmful to the rest of the we's. Totally. So the individuality is definitely it has to happen from the point of evolution. So there's some very interesting. So I noticed, I acknowledge that the time is up for the the 90 minutes I asked. So if you need to leave, thank you so much for being here. This time has been very important and nourishing and connecting for me. So if you need to leave, feel free for now, and feel free to reach out to me with more comments and connections. And I would like to stay addressing a few more threads that shown up in the chat, and you're welcome to stay with me. Okay. Great. So Marilyn, you have been holding up hand. I would like to, I'll invite you to speak in just a few minutes. I would like to, so Joe, do you want to give a recap of, I think there's a very interesting conversation you had with Wendy.
Well, just having to do with the way that we in the West, I mean, it's really part of what is promoted as emotional literacy.
Where's the hand? How do you access the
Ability to give name to different what you're feeling, and there's a lot more. There's a wider spread of words that have been developed to do that than in China, and my sense is that that's in part a sign of the underlying sort of handicap, in that here in the West, something doesn't exist unless it's nameable. And so there's a deep need to get more fine-grained specificity in what you're feeling, to be able to communicate to others and navigate that realm. But in China and other places, reality exists outside of language. Language is a nice, navigating vehicle, but it doesn't define reality. And so there are other ways that you're checking in with what's real in the feeling realm, especially, and it's not as necessary to give a specific name to it. So yeah, it's part of what I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, I think actually this is interesting. I want to address that too. Is that it's interesting that many of my Chinese friends also share same thing. They say, well, English-speaking people are much more expressive in their emotions and feelings. Which is true, but I think the feeling Joe and I are talking about is using feeling as a tentacle. What's the word?
Antenna.
Yeah, antenna to feel into the deeper reality, and not just the superficial expression of happiness, sad, angry. I think you are right. Actually, the Chinese are more constrained in expressing these surface emotion than the Western people, at least, right? The in modern time. So Marilyn, you've been holding up a hand. Would you like to say something or ask something?
Yes, I'm sorry, my video isn't working. There is a group that started out as being called Free the Children. There was child slavery in Pakistan a few decades ago, and a boy about 10 years old read about a Pakistani boy that had been murdered because he was working to free the children and help them escape child slavery. And he was that same age, and he decided, I will carry on his work. And so he started a group called Free the Children. They said they would give him a couple of minutes to talk at a labor union, and he talked for about 2 hours. They were so thrilled with what he was trying to do. He got young people from all over the world mobilized to go and build schools for the children that were being freed from slavery all around the world. And they were kids as old as 12 and up to teenage high school and college kids. The kids all over the world responded. They had the head of the United Nations took part. Nelson Mandela got involved, and they made a huge impact all over the world. Then they decided to change the name from me to we. And so they would have big events where they would bring in people that would inspire these young people to think beyond me and to think in terms of we. And they had a huge response. It was started by a boy in Canada, Eastern Canada. And it just inspires me, having been a retired teacher. I am so interested in anything that can inspire young people to get together and make a difference in the world. And this was started by a very young boy. And it just shows if young people get inspired, they can make a huge impact. They freed a lot of children. They would buy their freedom and build schools. And they had international teams that would come and build schools for the children that had been freed from slavery. To me, it's the most moving event I've ever heard of.
Thank you for sharing that, Marilyn. Yeah, I agree. Last week I was spending some time with some very young, not very young, but like 30s and 20 years old, and lived with them in a camp. And I really see that they do much more with fluency and enthusiasm than previous generations. All right. Andrea, did you?
Norman. I think you've got me, Norman Spring, rather than Andrea. And I'm not sure that I have my question clearly formulated, but I've always, or often at least, wondered about why we have so little sense of community here in the United States. Sometimes we come together in a crisis, an emergency, but oftentimes we don't continue that. So we only respond to the crisis, and when that's over, we go back to whatever we go back to. But I think that if I've understood you, the Tao is a spiritual basis for the we in China. In the United States, it seems like the formulation that we've all accepted, certainly I did, is that we have the opportunity to do and create anything that we want to here. We have the success myth, and it happens a lot. And it's just that in the process of succeeding in that sense of success, we've lost our souls. And we certainly have lost the caring about the we. And when I look at what's happening in the United States today, in terms of the great arguments that are taking place among Americans, it seems like the issue is about we versus those few who can rise to the top of the economic ladder. And that's really, in a sense, all I'm talking about. But as we all know, that has power and control that also goes along with it. I'm wondering, it seems like the United States was founded on that people leaving Europe and the oppression and the inability to lead the lives that they wanted to lead came here. And then a few generations later, we hear the myth about the streets in America are all paved in gold, and more immigrants are trying to get into the United States to accomplish that. So I kind of have some sense about where that may have come from, although I don't think my understanding of that is actually all that deep. On the other hand, I don't really understand the we in China. What does that grow out of? Does it grow out of simply the spiritual, or does it grow out of poverty, or does it grow, where does it come from?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. Again, I'm sharing with you my experience, what it is. A lot of it, the we grows out of pleasure, sharing pleasure together. The pleasure of food, the rituals of food, the rituals of storytelling, the rituals of, as mammals, we groom each other. I mean, we're not, I'm talking about the social grooming. There's a lot of social grooming happen each other. So you actually hit, like, what's the phrase? Hit the nail on the head. Is that how you say it?
I've seen I think there are 2 or 3 different metaphors all mixed up in that.
What, really?
I'm not sure which one you were trying for.
I think you're going for hit the nail on the head.
Hit the nail on the head.
Okay. that
Oh, are you saying that I hit the nail on the head?
yeah, you
I'm
hit the
not
nail
sure.
on the head when you say that we can only come together when there's a crisis. So it's we that come together to solve problem, to suffering through something. It's a different quality when the we come together to enjoy each other. I have this pleasure of seeing you. We, you know, the not so much in my Han culture, the ethnicity I'm come from, Han culture, but in other indigenous group, there's a lot of dancing, singing together, which I myself very much love. But in my Han culture, we kind of lost that. But in our culture, there's tons of storytelling, and just enjoying each other. I know that, in our industrialized, competitive, capitalistic society, we kind of lost that ability. It's that ability is stunted. Like we, and also the amount of insecurity people have with each other prevent us from enjoying each other. What's that?
Another factor is parenting. In China, and other we culture places, children are raised very differently than in the US with its nuclear families, isolated, two parents and only two parents. The extended family is very much a part of the child's experience of growing up. And I think it's in large part rooted there. I know you had that, Spring.
Yeah, the family structure, there's a okay, let me share you with this. For the longest time, like I'd say 10 years since I came to the United States, I didn't understand why people need a privacy and what does it mean to feel unsafe around other people. I couldn't understand. I understand mentally, but it's really like puzzles me. What does that mean? Like for example, when I grew up in a like household of 3 generations, our door is always open. A neighbor can walk in anytime while we are doing whatever. That's just the utter safety and just transparency. And also you have to be like really willing to expose your vulnerability. All these things are kind of came out of individualistic culture. So yeah, so that's a very different kind of we. It's a very earthy we, the we that kind of like a plant that grow out of the soils.
Spring, I also think that we have I think this is the phrase, a zero-sum consciousness, that there really isn't enough for all of us. So if I don't get in here and get mine, I'm going to lose it because you're going to grab it before I do. And I think that must not work very effectively if you're really thinking in terms of the greater community.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for Lynn and Alan pointing out in the chat room. What I talk about is really that kind of earthy way exists in Western culture too, in micro environments, or not, maybe not so micro in today, in Europe, in Italy and Greek. Okay, I think we're probably drawing to a conclusion. It's about 2 hours, and in the last 10 minutes, maybe just invite a few reflections of these 2 hours we spend together. Let's maybe I'll have let's have like a 1 minute of silence just to take what we've shared together in. And I know we have stirred up a lot of intellectual energies, and I would like to take a few deep breaths and let our attention settle in our the seat where we feel supported by the ground, connecting with gravity. And just be curious, like what kind of energy, what vibration your body is holding, what's stirring your heart. All right. So from this place, I would like to check out. I just this conversation is, let's see what's vibrating in my heart. I feel it's as if the people especially the women I talk with, worked with in China, I feel as if they were standing behind me. They want their voice to be heard through my voice. And thank you for allowing this space. And thank you for being a connection with also endless voice behind you, so that the invisible force behind me can hold hands with the invisible force behind you.
Thank you, Spring.
Thank you, Norman.
I would say that with more conversations like this, humanity would truly be one family.
Thank you, Aliyah.
Spring, I just want to say thank you for bringing who you are, your whole self into this conversation. I really, really valued it. Thank you.
Thank you for all you have served and contributed to our work.
Thank you for sharing the warm, caring core that you keep finding more deeply in yourself and in the roots with people you keep connecting with. Your roots keep leading you to. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I feel warmed up.
One of these roots is you, Michelle.
Yeah. Who would have known? Look who's here.
Spring, it's Joanne here. We met in Stephanie Mine's coursework back in 2020. And
right.
I just want to remind you that we all recognized you as a superstar back then. So carry on.
The women of the West and the women of the China. Yeah.
Yes, and I echo the same, having met you on the same time and so on. I just so lovely. I'm curious, are you still rewriting the I Ching in a feminine voice?
That's the kind of a guiding star that's a kind of an intention that guides my unfolding of my work. Right now, I'm writing a autobiography, memoir kind of book in Chinese in my native language. I realize I need to. It's almost like my prayer for the spirit of I Ching to open themselves up to me by so it's very tender process for me to write my story in my native language. And a lot of things I wrote cannot be published in China. So yeah, it's really a spirit, like a testing, like putting this huge energy into writing something that I don't know if you can see the light of the day, but that's the work of the magic. Yeah.
Well, and I would frame it by saying cannot be published now and leave it open for the future.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also with today's world, it can be even without formal publication, it can still see a lot of audience. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for this.
Yes, and keep singing. Put it in your songs.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Well, Joe and I will reopen our community of practice starting in January. Lots of goodies that coming. We'll have a very kind of a community-based, collective-based, way-based way of working with self-awareness, transformation, and how do we attune to our feelings as our guidance, and which also leading to the unfolding of I Ching into rebirthing of I Ching into resonance code, all of that. And it's going to be fun. Like what I said to Norman, I really want us to recreate that sense of being together and enjoying each other. It's not so much of wanting to be a better person or perfecting ourselves or be more developed, or I mean that will also come, but the most important thing is we would like to create a space that's welcoming, nourishing, yummy, and where we can be a we. So
maybe I will have to move to Bellingham.
Who is that saying that?
Leah.
Ah, yeah, you're not far anyway from here. Joe, do you have anything else to say?
It's been, the last 3 years has been quite enjoying. Look at me, I'm having trouble putting words to things, almost like as if I'm Chinese. Enjoyable, that's the word I'm looking for. To have this backseat view of what's going on with spring in China. A lot of what I got to experience was the WeChat conversations, these voices coming from across the Pacific into our home, talking about this and that and going through various challenges together and celebrating different milestones together and that sort of thing. It's been, and I don't understand Mandarin except for a word here and there. So for me, it's really completely nonverbal. What comes across is just the sounds of the voices and the energy in it. So, which feels true. There's something real there, and I'm just really curious to see what unfolds with that community moving forward, and eager to see the conclusion of the sort of consummation of Spring's memoir and where that goes. There is actually an editor involved who will probably help shape it in a way that can be published, I imagine. So but then there's so much possible. So, and it's cool to be here, kind of holding down the fort.
Yeah, and thank you, Joe, for being my partner. All that will be impossible or 10 times harder without your support and grounding. And all of you, even though this is the first time we connected, a lot of them in 3 years, but I feel your presence in our sphere and your heart and spirit and wish for more beautiful and sustaining future and culture is what's also my resource, the resource that I draw on. So to be continued, and happy New Year. Have a good hibernation time or nestling time in the winter, and we will be